So for number 4, we're looking at domain, and I'm going to look at these or explain them to you as the whole group. So I've got all of A through E up there. But for number 4, you want to first look to see which ones of these have some restrictions on their domain. And we mainly look for fractions because we know that 0 cannot be in the bottom of a fraction, so any x value that would cause that denominator to be 0, we have to kick out. It's not going to work. Also, we look for radicals because we know that we can't, on a graph, um, have a square root of a negative that would cause us to have an imaginary number. So as I'm looking at A through E, I'm first going to look for any of these problems that do not have radicals or fractions. So if you look like in number part A, no radical, no fraction, and so there aren't any restrictions, and my domain is going to go from negative infinity to infinity. Another way you can look at that one is by the shape of it. We know that that absolute value graph is going to end up being a V, and so as you look at that, if it were graphically, or if it was on a graph, then we would know that there is no break in that graph, so there's not going to be, there aren't any restrictions to the domain. It goes from negative infinity to positive infinity. We can also jump down to part E. Again, no radicals, no fractions. You can look at the shape of it. It's a parabola facing down, and again, you see there are no breaks from the left to the right. So the domain on that one as well would go from negative infinity to infinity. Come back up to number B, part B. We see that it is a fraction, so we know that whatever causes that denominator to be 0, we can't use in the domain. And in fact, the number 3 would cause that to be 0. If you set the denominator equal to 0, so negative x would be negative 3, x would be 3, that's going to show us what value can't be used in the domain. Now as I write that in interval notation, that's going to be every single real number except for 3. So the domain is going to go from negative infinity to 3. We can't include the 3, so we're going to use a parenthesis. We're going to join that together with the interval from 3 to infinity. So as if you're jumping over the 3, every other number can be used except for the 3. Go on to part C. Part C is the same idea. On this one, we're going to be first factoring that denominator. So to factor that way I can tell more easily what value of x would cause that to be 0. Looks like I would need a 3x and an x, 4 and negative 1. Does that work? 3x squared minus 3x plus 4x gives me the positive x minus 4. That's correct. So when I set that equal to 0, then 3x plus 4 would equal 0, or x minus 1 would equal 0. 3x would be negative 4. X would be negative 4/3, and then this other x would be a positive 1. So these are the two values that cannot be used in our domain. Now the trick is writing that now into interval notation. So the interval notation would be everything except those two. So from negative infinity to negative 4/3, I'm going to join that together with the interval from negative 4/3 to 1, and then from 1 to infinity. Notice there are parentheses around each one of those. We can't include those values in our domain. So that's going to be your domain for part C. And then part D, we have a radical. Now with a radical, whatever's underneath that radical has to end up being positive or 0. So I'm going to set that 2 minus x. It has to be greater than or equal to 0. So we're going to find the numbers that will work for our domain. So that's going to give me negative x is greater than or equal to negative 2. Now when I divide an inequality, divide both sides by a negative, it's going to flip the sign. So x is going to be less than or equal to positive 2. And in interval notation, that would look like all the numbers negative infinity to 2. We'll need a bracket there. And you can see that any number that I pull out of this interval, let's say I pull out a 0. If I plug that into my function, 2 minus 0, it gives me a positive square root of 2, which is good. Anything outside of that interval, let's say I pick a 3, 2 minus 3 gives me a square root of a negative, so that's why it's not included in that domain. So there's my answer.